There are moments in life when everything quietly falls apart. Not loudly, not all at once, but softly, through unanswered messages, missed chances, and the slow erosion of believing you matter. We move through days doing what's required, saying what's expected, smiling when we're supposed to, yet somewhere inside, a question echoes. Was I ever enough to begin with? This is a story about self-worth, about how we lose it without noticing, and how it sometimes returns from the most unexpected place. In a small, unremarkable town where nothing ever seemed to change, there lived a man named Adrian Cole. He wasn't broken in the obvious ways, but he had forgotten his value, and that forgetting shaped every step of his journey. Listen closely, because this story isn't just about him, it's about you. Adrian Cole lived a life that looked complete from the outside. Every morning he woke before the sun, not because he loved mornings, but because it felt responsible. He brewed his coffee the same way every day, 2 scoops, no sugar, stood by the window and watched the town stretch awake. The streets were familiar, the sounds were predictable, and so was he. Adrian was the kind of man people described as reliable, not inspiring, not unforgettable, just dependable. At work, he was always early. He listened more than he spoke. When something went wrong, his name was the first suggestion. When something went right, it quietly belonged to everyone else. He didn't complain. He told himself that being needed was enough, that usefulness was a form of value, but beneath that calm routine lived a belief he never said out loud. If I stop giving, I disappear. Adrian's self-worth was built on being useful to others. He answered calls late at night, took on extra work without question. He remembered birthdays, fixed problems, carried weight that wasn't his. And every time someone said, "I don't know what we'd do without you," it felt like oxygen. Still, when the room emptied, so did the warmth. He went home each evening to a small apartment that echoed more than it should. The walls were bare, not because he didn't care, but because he'd never felt permanent anywhere long enough to decorate. He ate dinner alone, often standing, scrolling through messages that rarely included his name unless someone needed something. And yet, he told himself he was fine, because admitting the truth would mean facing the fear underneath it all, that maybe without effort, without service, without constant proving, he wasn't enough on his own. You know this feeling, the one where you try harder not because you're passionate, but because you're afraid. Afraid that if you slow down, someone will realize they don't need you anymore. Afraid that love, respect, and belonging must be earned every single day. Adrian believed rest had to be justified, that saying no made him selfish, that his worth expired the moment he stopped performing. And so, he kept going. He kept showing up with quiet discipline, kept offering strength even when his own felt thin, kept mistaking exhaustion for purpose. But life has a way of testing the stories we tell ourselves, and soon Adrian would face a moment that forced one impossible question to the surface. If everything I give is taken away, who am I then? That question followed him like a shadow, unanswered, uncomfortable, waiting. And this, though he didn't know it yet, was the beginning of his journey. Adrian believed that if he just did a little more, everything would finally feel right. So he leaned into effort like it was a lifeline. He arrived earlier than necessary and left later than expected. He volunteered before anyone could ask. When problems appeared, he stepped forward instinctively, as if solving them might quiet the question he carried inside. There was a strange comfort in exhaustion. It made him feel necessary. It made him feel visible. And for a while, it worked. His manager nodded with approval. Co-workers smiled when they saw him coming. His phone buzzed more often. Small victories stacked up. Praise in passing, trust implied. Responsibilities increased. These moments fed him. They whispered, "See, you matter." Adrian mistook that whisper for truth. He started believing that worth was something you could accumulate, like hours worked, like favors owed, like being indispensable. He told himself that this was motivation, that this was discipline, that this was purpose. But beneath the surface, something fragile was forming, because every success came with a silent condition. Don't slow down. Don't disappoint. Don't need anything in return. He noticed how uneasy he felt when there was nothing to fix, how rest made him restless, how silence made him doubt himself. On days when no one asked for his help, he felt strangely hollow, as if usefulness was the only language he spoke fluently. At night, when he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his thoughts replayed the day like a ledger. What he had done right, what he could have done better, who he had pleased, who he might have let down. Sleep came late, crowded by the fear that tomorrow he'd have to prove it all over again. You may recognize this rhythm, the cycle of trying to earn what should have been inherent, the belief that self-worth is fragile and must be constantly protected through effort, the quiet pressure to be exceptional just to feel acceptable. Adrian didn't ask himself what he wanted. That question felt unfamiliar, even dangerous. Wanting implied entitlement, needing implied weakness, so instead he focused on being needed, and the world rewarded him for it. But rewards built on conditional value are unstable. They depend on performance. They vanish when circumstances change. And Adrian didn't see the flaw yet, only the momentum. He thought he was building a life. In truth, he was building an identity that could collapse the moment he was no longer useful. Still, there was hope in his eyes, a cautious optimism. He believed he was getting closer to something meaningful, that if he kept going, kept giving, kept pushing, one day he would finally feel secure in who he was. But life rarely lets us cling to illusions for long, because sometimes the very thing we build our worth upon is the first thing taken away. And when that happens, everything we avoided begins to surface. The fall didn't announce itself. There was no dramatic warning, no moment where the world paused to prepare Adrian for what was coming. It arrived the way most real losses do, quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as another ordinary day. He was called into a meeting he didn't expect. The room felt smaller than usual, the air heavier. Faces that once looked to him for answers now avoided his eyes. Words were spoken, careful, rehearsed, polite, but none of them softened the truth. Changes were being made. The direction was shifting. His role was no longer essential. Adrian listened without interrupting. He nodded when expected. He thanked them for the opportunity. Discipline had trained him well. He carried himself with dignity, even as something inside him fractured. It wasn't anger that hit first. It was confusion. He walked home in a fog, replaying every late night, every extra task, every moment he had chosen work over rest, giving over, asking. He searched for the mistake that must have justified this ending. Surely effort counted for something. Surely loyalty meant protection, but the answers didn't come. At home, he sat on the edge of his bed, still wearing his coat, staring at nothing. The silence pressed in. His phone stayed still. No messages, no reassurance, no one saying, "This doesn't make sense." That's when the doubt turned cruel. If all I am is what I do, and I can no longer do it, then what am I now? Failure wrapped itself around his chest, not as a single event, but as a verdict. It whispered that his value had been overestimated, that he had confused being helpful with being irreplaceable, that he had believed in a version of himself that only existed while he was producing something useful. You know this feeling too. When effort doesn't protect you, when discipline doesn't guarantee security, when motivation collapses under the weight of reality. Adrian felt exposed, stripped of the role that had defined him. The praise that once fueled him now felt like a memory from someone else's life. He questioned every choice, every sacrifice, every moment he had pushed through exhaustion just to be seen. And the hardest truth wasn't the loss itself. It was realizing how much of himself he had tied to something that could disappear overnight. The days that followed blurred together. He went through the motions, but the purpose was gone. Without a place to pour his energy, his thoughts turned inward, and they were not kind. Failure, he learned, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you and asks a single question you're not ready to answer. Who are you without your achievements? Adrian didn't know. And instead of facing that question, he did what many of us do. He ran from acceptance, from grief, from the truth that something had ended. And in that running, he would lose even more. Adrian refused to let go of the story he had told himself. He woke each morning as if nothing had changed. Same alarm, same coffee, same routine. But the meaning behind it was gone. Still, he held on to the habits, believing that discipline alone could reverse what had already happened. If he stayed sharp, stayed ready, stayed useful, maybe the world would notice its mistake. He refreshed his email too often, replayed conversations he couldn't change, imagined alternate endings where someone realized his value too late. This wasn't hope. It was denial disguised as effort. Adrian measured himself by an old ruler, one that only counted productivity, approval, and external validation. Without those numbers rising, he felt himself shrinking. He compared his present silence to his past busyness and decided it meant something about his worth as a person. So he clung tighter. He offered help where it wasn't asked for, gave advice where it wasn't needed, said yes even when it cost him energy he no longer had. Each action was a plea disguised as generosity. See me, choose me, confirm that I still matter. But the world didn't respond the way he hoped. People were polite, distant, busy with their own lives, and every neutral response felt like rejection. Every unanswered message reinforced the fear that usefulness had been the only reason he had ever been welcomed. You may know this place, where letting go feels like losing the last proof that you're worthy, where moving forward feels like betrayal of the version of you who tried so hard, where identity becomes a prison built from past success. Adrian told himself that accepting the loss meant admitting failure, that releasing the old measure meant lowering his standards. He didn't yet see that the measure itself had been flawed, that it had never accounted for his humanity, only his output. At night, guilt kept him awake. Guilt for not doing more. guilt for feeling bitter, guilt for wanting recognition in a world that had moved on. He carried shame quietly, like a second skin. And the more he held on to the past, the heavier it became. His mind stayed crowded with what-ifs and if-onlys, leaving no room for peace. The truth hovered close, waiting patiently. You cannot heal while clinging to the version of yourself that no longer exists. But Adrian wasn't ready to hear that yet. Because letting go isn't just about release, it's about grief. And grief requires us to sit with emptiness before we find meaning again. So he stayed stuck, between who he was and who he could become, between effort and exhaustion, between worth and the fear of being nothing without proof. And in that space, the silence grew louder. Soon it would pull him somewhere deeper, somewhere lonelier, somewhere he could no longer avoid himself. Eventually, the noise stopped, not because things got better, but because Adrian ran out of energy to pretend they might. The messages slowed. The offers to help went unanswered. The days stretched long and unstructured, no longer shaped by urgency or expectation. Without a role to fill, Adrian found himself alone with something he had avoided for years: silence. At first, he tried to escape it. He filled his time with distractions, long walks with no destination, television playing in the background, scrolling without purpose. But silence has a way of waiting, patient, unmoving. And when you finally sit with it, it reveals what effort once kept hidden. Adrian stopped shaving, stopped setting alarms, stopped caring about how the days looked from the outside. He wasn't falling apart dramatically. He was fading, quietly, invisibly, in ways no one noticed. And that hurt the most. Because if no one noticed his absence, did it mean he had never truly been present? He sat alone in his apartment, the same walls now feeling closer, heavier. The echoes he once ignored now spoke back to him. Memories of praise felt distant, accomplishments felt irrelevant. Without an audience, his achievements lost their meaning. You may recognize this emptiness, the space that appears when identity collapses, the hollow pause between who you were and who you don't yet know how to be, the moment when motivation disappears and all that's left is raw honesty. Adrian felt small, not in the humble sense, but in the way that makes you question your place in the world. He wondered if he had confused activity with importance, if all his discipline had only been a shield to avoid facing himself. Some nights he lay awake, staring into the dark, asking questions with no answers. If I stop trying, am I still worthy of love? If no one needs me, do I still matter? If I have nothing to offer, can I still belong? These thoughts didn't come with panic. They arrived slowly, like a heavy fog, settling, lingering, making everything feel distant. This was his lowest point. Not because he had lost everything, but because he no longer knew why he existed beyond what he could give. Yet even here, at the bottom, something important was happening. The silence wasn't punishing him. It was making space. Space for truth. Space for healing. Space for a question deeper than failure. What if your worth was never something you had to earn? Adrian didn't have the answer yet. He only knew that the old ways no longer worked, that trying harder had led him here, and that something gentle, unexpected, would have to change. Soon, change would arrive, not as a solution, not as motivation, but as a moment, a simple moment with a stranger, That would remind him of something he had forgotten long ago. The encounter happened on a day that felt no different from the rest. Adrian was sitting on a bench near the edge of town, the kind of place people passed through without noticing. The trees stood still. The sky was pale and undecided. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He rarely was anymore. He watched people walk by, couples mid-conversation, parents tugging children along, strangers absorbed in their own urgency. Everyone seemed to be going somewhere that mattered. He felt separate from it all. Then someone sat beside him. Not close enough to intrude, not far enough to ignore, just present. It was an older man, ordinary in appearance, no dramatic entrance, no wisdom written on his face. He wore a simple coat, slightly worn at the edges, and held a paper cup of coffee like it was something to be savored rather than rushed. For a while, they sat in silence. Adrian expected the man to check his phone, to leave, to fill the space with small talk, but he didn't. He just sat there, breathing slowly, watching the world as if it wasn't something to conquer. After a few minutes, the man spoke, not looking at Adrian. Hard days have a way of making benches feel heavier. The words weren't sharp, they weren't probing, they were gentle, observant. Adrian almost shrugged them off, almost stayed quiet, but something in the man's tone, something uncurious yet kind, made honesty feel possible. "I guess I've had a few," Adrian said. The man nodded, as if that was enough explanation. "You look like someone who's been carrying weight that no one taught him how to put down." That sentence landed differently, not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate. No one had spoken to Adrian like that before, not in a way that didn't ask for justification, not in a way that didn't expect performance in return. They talked for a while, about nothing important. The weather, the town, how fast life moves when you don't ask it to slow down. The man never asked Adrian what he did, never asked what he was trying to become. He didn't offer advice, he didn't try to fix anything, he simply listened. And in that listening, Adrian felt something unfamiliar. He felt seen. Not for his usefulness, not for his discipline, not for what he could offer, just for being there. Before leaving, the man stood and said something Adrian would carry with him long after the bench was empty. "You don't owe the world your exhaustion to earn your place in it." Then he walked away. No name, no follow-up, no promise of answers, just kindness, given freely, without condition. Adrian sat there long after the man was gone. The words echoed, not loudly, but steadily, like a truth knocking softly, waiting to be let in. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. And sometimes, that's all it takes for healing to begin. Adrian didn't wake up the next morning transformed. There was no sudden clarity, no surge of motivation, no dramatic promise to become someone new. What he felt instead was quieter and far more unsettling. He felt the urge to stay with the discomfort, stay with the questions, stay without rushing to prove anything. The stranger's words lingered in his mind, not as a command but as permission. "You don't owe the world your exhaustion." Adrian repeated it while brushing his teeth, while making coffee, while sitting alone in the stillness he once feared. For the first time, he didn't immediately reach for distraction. He began with something small, almost invisible. He stopped apologizing for taking up space. When he rested, he let it be. Rest, not recovery for the next performance. When he felt tired, he didn't judge it as weakness. He simply noticed it. This was discipline of a different kind, not the discipline of pushing through pain, but the discipline of listening. Adrian started taking short walks with no purpose beyond movement. He cooked simple meals instead of skipping them. He wrote in a notebook, not plans or goals, but thoughts he'd never allowed himself to finish. Some pages were messy, some were quiet. All of them were honest. He noticed how often his mind tried to measure his worth. You should be doing more. You're falling behind. This isn't enough. Instead of obeying those thoughts, he practiced letting them pass. Letting go wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive, gentle, unremarkable. And yet, something inside him softened. He realized how rarely he had chosen himself, not in selfish ways, but in human ones. How often he had abandoned his own needs to stay acceptable. How deeply he had believed that love required effort and rest required permission. Healing didn't feel like happiness. It felt like relief. Some days doubt returned in waves. He wondered if he was becoming lazy, if he was wasting time, if the world would forget him entirely. But each time those fears rose, he remembered the bench, the silence, the feeling of being seen without explanation. That memory grounded him. Adrian began to understand something quietly powerful. Self-worth isn't built through constant doing. It's revealed when you stop abandoning yourself. He didn't suddenly love who he was, but he stopped rejecting himself. And that alone changed the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he moved through the day. For the first time, his life wasn't about earning a place. It was about learning how to stay in it. This was not the end of his struggle. Old habits don't disappear just because we recognize them. And soon the familiar voice of doubt would return, testing the ground he was standing on. But this time, Adrian would not be facing it empty-handed. He had something new now, a quiet sense of self-worth, still fragile, still forming, but finally, his own. Growth has a way of attracting resistance. Just when Adrian began to feel steadier, the old voice returned, not as a shout, but as a whisper he almost trusted. It came in the morning when his phone stayed silent a little too long. It came when he passed familiar buildings and wondered who had replaced him. It came disguised as practicality, asking questions that sounded reasonable. How long can you live like this? Shouldn't you be doing more by now? What if this calm is just avoidance? The voice didn't accuse, it reminded of urgency, of expectation, of the version of himself that survived by proving his worth. Adrian felt the pull. He caught himself scrolling job listings late at night, not out of excitement, but fear. He drafted messages he didn't send, considered reaching out just to feel relevant again. The old reflex to offer, to fix, to perform, itched beneath his skin. This was the real test. Not failure, not loss, but temptation. The temptation to return to what was familiar even if it was harmful. The temptation to confuse busyness with purpose again. To trade peace for validation because peace didn't yet feel productive. You know this moment, when growth feels fragile and the past feels certain. When old patterns call you back with the promise of safety, when discipline becomes choosing what not to do. Adrian didn't silence the voice. He listened, then questioned it. Was he avoiding responsibility or learning balance? Was he resting or rebuilding? Was worth really something that expired with time? Instead of reacting, he paused. He remembered the bench, the stranger's calm presence, the feeling of being enough without explanation. That memory didn't erase the doubt, but it softened its grip. Adrian chose restraint. He delayed decisions. He allowed uncertainty to exist without rushing to fix it. This, too, was discipline, the kind that trusts process over panic. Some days he slipped, reached for reassurance, measured himself too harshly, but he noticed it now, and noticing changed everything. Strength wasn't in never returning to old habits. It was in recognizing them sooner and choosing differently. Slowly, the voice lost volume, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer controlled him. Adrian wasn't chasing peace anymore. He was protecting it. And in doing so, something new began to take shape, not built from fear or effort, but from intention. The world didn't suddenly reward him for this change, but for the first time he didn't need it to. Because what was growing inside him was quieter than ambition and far more powerful. The change arrived so subtly that Adrian almost missed it. There was no single morning where he woke up feeling complete. No moment when everything made sense at once. Instead, life began to feel lighter. Not easier, but less heavy. As if he was no longer carrying himself like a burden. He noticed it in the way he moved through his days. He woke without dread, ate without rushing, walked without counting steps toward some invisible goal. Time no longer felt like an enemy to outrun. It felt like something to inhabit. Adrian began choosing work again, but this time with intention. Not to prove anything, not to disappear into usefulness, but to contribute from a place of balance. He asked questions before committing. He said no when his energy asked for it. And surprisingly, the world didn't collapse. Some doors closed, others opened quietly. What mattered was that his sense of purpose no longer depended on being indispensable. Purpose, he learned, wasn't about being needed by everyone. It was about being aligned with yourself. You may recognize this shift when motivation stops coming from fear, when discipline becomes self-respect, when peace replaces the constant chase for approval. Adrian found fulfillment in smaller moments now, conversations without agendas, work done well, then released, evenings that didn't need to be earned. He felt grounded in ways he had never been while striving. Failure no longer defined him. Success no longer consumed him. He understood now that self-worth wasn't something he could lose. It wasn't stored in titles or praise. It lived in his ability to stay present, honest, and kind to himself, especially when no one was watching. Sometimes he returned to the bench, not to wait, not to reflect painfully, but to sit. He wondered if the stranger knew what he had given him. Probably not. That was the point. The gift had been free. No strings, no expectations. A reminder that value doesn't require validation. Adrian carried that lesson forward. His life didn't become extraordinary in visible ways. It became true. And that truth brought a quiet joy, one that didn't fade when circumstances changed. He had found something deeper than motivation. He had found peace. And peace, once discovered, becomes a compass. It guides you, not toward more, but toward enough. The journey had changed him, not into someone new, but into someone whole. And now, there was only one thing left to do: to share the lesson, softly, honestly, with you. If you've listened this far, this story has already found you for a reason. Because somewhere in Adrian's journey there is a reflection of your own. Maybe you've been measuring your worth by how much you give. Maybe you've mistaken exhaustion for purpose. Maybe you've believed quietly, deeply, that love, respect, or belonging must be earned through constant effort. Let this story offer you a gentler truth. Your worth was never conditional. It did not begin with your achievements, and it does not end with your failures. You are allowed to rest without explanation. You are allowed to say no without guilt. You are allowed to exist without proving your value to anyone. Discipline is not self-punishment. It is self-respect. Motivation does not come from fear. It grows from alignment. Failure is not the opposite of worth. It is often the doorway to healing. Letting go is not giving up on yourself. It is releasing the version of you that survived by shrinking. Strength is not found in being needed. It is found in staying present when no one is watching. And rebirth does not arrive as a dramatic transformation. It arrives quietly when you stop abandoning yourself. So if you are standing at the edge of silence right now, unsure of who you are without effort, stay. Stay with the discomfort. Stay with the questions. Stay long enough to discover that peace was never something you had to earn. This is your journey, and it is not over. If this story brought you clarity, comfort, or courage, take a moment to like it, share it with someone who may need it, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Until next time, be gentle with yourself. You are already enough.